It was the biggest food fraud of the century. Consumers were shocked by news that some of their beef burgers, favourite frozen food and ready meals, contained horse meat. But 10 months on, and several investigations later, the public is still waiting for answers as to how horse meat got into our food. How long had it been there? And will anyone ever be held to account? So far, only one company in the UK has been charged, but the big-name supermarkets and meat processors appear to be off the hook. I've been investigating how one strand of this complex supply chain has worked for The Guardian. And we've discovered that meat from a Dutch factory, whose owners accused of mixing old and rotten beef with horse, ended up in one of the largest beef processors in Europe. And that big beef processors factory made burgers that turned out to be adulterated with horse for Tesco, Burger King, the Co-op and Aldi.
Dit is paardenvlees, dit is rundvlees.
That businessman is Dutch factory owner and fraud suspect Willie Selton, who was ordered to recall 50,000 tonnes of meat, enough for more than 100 million packs of burgers. For the first time, our Guardian investigation shows not only where Willie Selton's meat went, but also the shocking conditions at an abattoir that delivered to Selton. The horse meat scandal broke in January this year. Tests carried out in Ireland found horse DNA in a number of big brand name beef products. One, a Tesco value beef burger, contained as much as 29% horse meat. Countries and companies started blaming each other as the demand for an explanation grew. There were police raids. 3 men were arrested on suspicion of fraud at a meat plant in Wales and an abattoir in Yorkshire in February, but there are no charges against them. At the heart of the meat adulteration scandal, as it broke, was ABP, one of Europe's biggest beef processing companies. It's owned by Larry Goodman, one of Ireland's most prominent and successful businessmen. Although ABP admits it broke its contracts by going outside the list of suppliers approved by retailers, it's always declined to give full details of exactly where its burger meat came from.
And can you give us the names of those?
I'm not in a position to give the name of individual suppliers at this point.
And can you say why you're not in a position?
I'd like to be very careful with regard to naming companies in this forum because our investigation isn't complete.
ABP says no one in the company ever knowingly bought horse meat, and they didn't know they were including horse in burgers mislabelled as beef. It's not illegal to put horse in meat for human consumption, but it must be labelled as horse meat. An executive from another meat processing company explained what the motive for mixing horse and beef might be. Jim Fairbairn told MPs that horse might get mixed with beef if someone was trying to increase the so-called visual lean protein or VL content of cheap meat, although he personally had never done it.
How would one do it? How would one go about it? Would it involve labelling, mislabelling and swapping of labels? Would that be part of how one would go about doing this? Would it involve double bookkeeping? What are the tools of the trade that somebody might use to do this?
I've never worked on the butchery floor.
No, but you know the industry. Yeah, you know the industry.
I would say it's quite obvious from the results, really, that you will not get a full box of equine. What you will get maybe is half a box of bovine and half a box of equine. I mean, horse meat, especially horses now that are very thin, and that's why they've been slaughtered, because people can't feed them, and their fat content would be minimal, and they would actually up the average VL in that box.
The Guardian investigation can now reveal that one of ABP's sources of meat was Willie Selton. Selton's meat factory, tucked away in an unassuming industrial estate in a small town called Os in Holland, was where a trader bought meat on ABP's behalf. A few weeks after testing had first revealed the presence of horse meat in foods labelled as beef, Selton was ordered to recall 50,000 tonnes of meat that he'd sold to 16 countries throughout Europe, because the authorities said he couldn't show where it had come from. I began the search for the source of horse in burgers, and in May, following a tip-off, I retraced the route taken by one truckload of horse meat to the town of Oss. My aim was to speak to Willie Selton about his business practices and the companies he sold his products to. Shortly after our trip, Selton was arrested and questioned on suspicion of fraud and false accounting. The Dutch authorities alleged he'd received 300 tonnes of horse meat from England, Ireland and the Netherlands in the last 2 years. Yet his books, they said, only showed beef. He says he's innocent of any wrongdoing.
Omdat er toch continu beschuldigingen komen aan mijn adres die niet waar zijn, onjuist zijn en met name criminele activiteiten, dat klopt gewoon niet. En dat is iets dat we willen bewijzen dat het onjuist is.
But the men working for Selton told a different story.
No praktycznie wszystko, nie? Bo ja to widziałem, to przez moje ręce przechodziło, nie?
Koninę i wołowinę?
No dokładnie. Czy jeszcze ogólnie to już o zapach mi chodziło, stare ogólnie było czekanie.
Old meat smelling.
And another former employee corroborated these claims.
Tak, na przykład był dzień taki, to przyjeżdżało mięso na paletach stare i zawsze pod koniec pracy, po sprzątaniu, żeśmy zaczynali robić takie coś. Przepakowywaliśmy to mięso po prostu.
Czasami mięso miało taki nieprzyjemny zapach, że naprawdę trzeba było owijać sobie twarze jakimiś ścierkami, po prostu żeby nie czuć tego, bo aż normalnie odrzucało. Ten zapach był tak nieprzyjemny, że to się w głowie nie mieści.
Części tego konia szły normalnie do pakowania, jako też wołowina, bo żadne kartki inne nie były tam wkładane. Tak, no kartki były non-stop te same.
Selton has denied fraud and false accounting and told us through his lawyers that where old meat was being cleaned up and mixed with horse meat, he intended it for pet food. He told us he'd never mislabelled meat. So where was Selton's meat coming from? Who was sending raw material for the thousands of tons of meat he was producing? One of the companies that supplied Selton with his meat was an abattoir fast becoming notorious in the UK. The Red Lion abattoir in Cheshire had already got itself a reputation for cruelty among near neighbours, who said they could hear animals being abused before slaughter. Last year, animal rights activists planted cameras inside the abattoir to see if there was any truth in the allegations. Some of the evidence is painful to watch. Suspicions about what else was going on inside the abattoir were also growing among animal welfare groups. The Ulster Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals had noticed a growing number of trips across the Irish Sea with truckloads of horses. Such large numbers of old and sometimes sick horses of such low value were being exported from Northern Ireland and into Scotland and England that the trade only made sense if they were being sold for meat.
We began to notice that there were certain individuals using the ports on a very regular basis, sometimes 3 and 4 times a week, taking horses out of this country, and we just couldn't understand why. It just didn't make any sense. You know, why on earth would people be spending money moving animals that had no value?
An answer was to come 6 months ahead of the horse meat scandal, when an investigation by the USPCA and their Scottish counterparts resulted in an Irish horse trader called Lawrence McAllister having his vehicle impounded on the suspicion that he was transporting sick, diseased animals between Ireland and Scotland.
He decided to transport animals that were unfit for transport. The animals were suffering, they were lame, they couldn't stand on the lorry. And they impounded that lorry, and during that impoundment process they discovered in the cab of the lorry 40 forged Irish horse passports and a box of microchips.
Microchips and passports are used to identify horses throughout the UK. Earlier this year, a former truck driver spoke to BBC Northern Ireland's Spotlight programme. He claimed that he'd been working for a criminal gang of horse smugglers and that he had transported horses that were sick or starving and often with false passports to the same abattoir.
I'm going to show you a photograph. Can you tell me what this photograph is?
The Red Lion, and we drove in around the back, and at the back of it there is another intake door, and we went in through the back intake doors.
Since then, sources engaged in enforcement have told The Guardian that they have evidence that the Red Lion had been one destination for McAllister's horses bought from Ireland. Red Lion in turn made regular horse meat deliveries to Selton in Holland. The Red Lion operation has now been charged